Now that you know what artifacts to create and what to skip, you are ready to understand the architecture development method cycle as the operating rhythm of enterprise architecture. The architecture development method is not meant to be a rigid project plan. It is a leadership cycle that helps you move an organization from uncertainty to clarity, from disconnected initiatives to aligned roadmaps, and from uncontrolled change to governed delivery. In this lecture, you will learn how to run the architecture development method cycle practically, so it becomes a repeatable decision-making engine that supports strategy, governance, and execution without slowing teams down. Building on that intent, you should recognize why many organizations struggle with the architecture development method. They treat it like a checklist that demands documentation, instead of a decision cycle that enables progress. They try to run every phase in full detail, even when the decision is small, which creates frustration and delays. Or they treat architecture as something done once at the start and never revisited, which causes drift and rework later. When the architecture development method is misused, it becomes either too heavy or too irrelevant. TOGAF 10 encourages a more practical approach where you tailor the cycle to fit the context and use it to guide decisions at the pace the organization is moving. With those failure patterns in mind, you can adopt a mental model that makes the architecture development method useful. You can treat it as a decision journey with three outcomes: direction, alignment, and control. Direction means you define what you are aiming for and why. Alignment means you build shared understanding across leaders, teams, and stakeholders, so work moves in the same direction. Control means you govern execution through standards, compliance checks, and exception handling so you do not drift. When you run the architecture development method with this mental model, every phase becomes a way to reduce uncertainty and increase confidence. That is how you lead the cycle like an enterprise architect rather than managing it like an administrative process. Now that you have a leadership mental model, you need to tailor the cycle so it fits real delivery environments. Tailoring does not mean skipping thinking. It means choosing the depth of work based on risk, complexity, and urgency. If you are guiding an enterprise-wide platform decision, you go deep because the consequences are long-lasting. If you are guiding a content product enhancement, you keep the cycle light and focus on guardrails and decision points. The discipline remains the same. You still clarify outcomes, define target direction, evaluate options, sequence change, and govern delivery. The difference is that you right-size the effort so architecture supports flow instead of becoming the bottleneck. With tailoring understood, you should see that the cycle begins before the formal phases even feel like they start. In the real world, you often begin with a trigger such as a regulatory change, a major incident, a budget decision, a new strategy, or a transformation program. Your first job is to clarify what problem you are solving and what outcomes matter. Because if you start modeling without purpose, you waste time. This early clarity sets the tone for the whole cycle. It ensures that the architecture development method is not a theoretical exercise, but a response to a real enterprise need with real accountability. Now that you know the cycle begins with a trigger, you need to establish the conditions that make architecture effective. This includes clarifying governance, principles, standards, and decision rights so that architecture direction can be enforced. It also includes clarifying how architecture fits into the organization's operating model, such as how you engage with product teams, platform teams, and portfolio governance. When these conditions are weak, architecture becomes advisory and optional, which leads to drift. When these conditions are strong, architecture becomes an enabling system that helps teams deliver safely. This is why the early part of the architecture development method is leadership heavy, because it is about building the organizational capability to make architecture work. With the foundation in place, the first practical move in the cycle is to create an architecture vision that leaders and teams can rally behind. The vision is not a diagram of a future state. It is an agreement on outcomes, scope, constraints, and what success looks like. You use the vision to shape stakeholder expectations and to define what is in and out of scope. You also use it to identify the most important trade-offs that must be decided early, such as speed versus risk, standardization versus flexibility, and build versus bidirection. A strong vision reduces later conflict because it makes the enterprise intent explicit and shared. Now that the vision is clear, you anchor the cycle on the business architecture perspective because that is where outcomes become concrete. You use capabilities and value streams to clarify what the enterprise needs to be able to do and how value is delivered end to end. This step prevents technology first thinking, where teams jump to tools and platforms without understanding the enterprise problem. By clarifying capability gaps and value stream friction, you can justify why investment is needed and where it should be targeted. This is also where you set the stage for measurable outcomes, because capability improvements and value stream performance can be tracked over time. With business direction anchored, you move to information systems architecture thinking, so you can guide data and application decisions in a way that supports the enterprise. At this stage, your role is not to design technical details, but to shape strategic choices such as data ownership principles, data quality expectations, authoritative sources, and application rationalization direction. You also identify where applications should be consolidated, where shared services should exist, and where integration must be standardized. When you do this well, you reduce duplication and reduce inconsistent definitions that cause operational confusion. This step protects long-term sustainability because it stops each team from creating its own data truth and its own application islands. Now that data and application direction is clear, you guide technology architecture decisions that create stability without blocking innovation. Technology architecture, in leadership terms, is about platform strategy, integration patterns, security direction, operational requirements, and resilience expectations. You define what must be standard, such as identity and access approaches, monitoring requirements, and approved hosting patterns. You also define what is flexible, so teams can innovate where it is safe. This is where you reduce cost and risk by preventing uncontrolled sprawl of platforms and tools. When technology direction is clear, delivery becomes faster because teams stop debating foundations and start building solutions. With architecture direction defined, you now shift to the practical question. What are the solution paths that can deliver the target outcomes? This stage is not about creating one perfect answer. It is about framing realistic options and their implications. You explore work packages and solution building blocks that can be reused across the enterprise, such as shared identity services, integration platforms, data platforms, and standard monitoring patterns. You also identify dependencies and sequencing constraints. Leaders need this because they fund options, not ideals. Delivery teams need this because they build in increments and they need clarity on what comes first. Now that options are visible, you plan migration in a way that respects operational reality. In enterprise change, sequencing is often more important than design because the wrong sequence can cause business disruption, budget waste, and delivery failure. You shape a roadmap that moves from current state constraints to target direction through manageable transition states. You prioritize foundational capabilities first, such as platform guardrails, security controls, and shared services before large-scale migrations. You also account for organizational readiness, vendor timelines, and compliance deadlines. This is how the architecture development method becomes a practical planning tool rather than a theoretical method, because it helps the enterprise change safely while still moving forward. With the roadmap in place, you need implementation governance to ensure architecture direction is followed during execution. This is where many architects either become too controlling or too disconnected. Practical implementation governance focuses on key decision points, compliance to non-negotiable standards, and transparent exception handling. You do not micromanage every design choice. You ensure the enterprise guardrails are followed and the risks are visible. You support delivery teams by providing reusable patterns and clear standards, so compliance is easy. When implementation governance is designed this way, it improves speed because it prevents late-stage surprises and rework while still allowing teams to deliver within agreed boundaries. Now that governance is active, you need to ensure architecture remains relevant because the enterprise will keep changing. Strategy shifts, technology evolves, threats increase, and business priorities change. Architecture change management is how you keep your target direction, standards, and roadmaps current without constant reinvention. You monitor change triggers such as new regulations, new incidents, vendor changes, and major portfolio shifts. You then decide what needs updating and what can remain stable. This is how the architecture development method becomes continuous rather than episodic. It keeps architecture as a living capability that guides the enterprise through ongoing change. With the full cycle in mind, imagine you are leading the architecture development method cycle for a security and cloud uplift across multiple business units. The trigger is rising cyber risk and inconsistent controls across environments. You establish governance conditions, including principles such as secure by design and standard monitoring requirements. You create a vision that defines outcomes such as consistent identity and access, improved incident response readiness, and reduced configuration drift. You map value streams such as incident response and access provisioning, and identify capability gaps such as identity governance and logging maturity. You define information systems direction such as authoritative data sources for identity and asset inventory. You set technology directions such as approved hosting patterns, monitoring baselines, and security control guardrails. You then define solution options such as shared platforms and reusable patterns, sequence the migration to build foundations first, and govern implementation through compliance checks and exceptions. The result is not a pile of artifacts, it is a controlled, measurable uplift that leaders can fund and teams can deliver. Now that you have seen the cycle in action, you need to recognize what success looks like. The cycle is working when decisions are made faster with less conflict because stakeholders share the same architecture direction. It is working when delivery has fewer late redesigns because guardrails and compliance checks happen early. It is working when duplication reduces because application and platform choices are more consistent. It is working when risk is visible and exceptions are explicit because governance is transparent. And it is working when leaders trust the roadmap because it is tied to outcomes and sequencing logic. These signals are more meaningful than the number of diagrams produced because they show that architecture is changing how the enterprise behaves. Let's now discuss the key takeaways from what you learned so far so you can apply it immediately. You learned that the TOGAF 10 architecture development method is not a rigid project plan. It is a leadership cycle that turns uncertainty into direction, alignment, and control. You learned that the most practical way to use the cycle is to treat it as a decision journey that supports outcomes, governance, and execution. You learned that tailoring is essential and you should right-size the depth of each phase based on risk and complexity without losing discipline. You learned that the early parts of the cycle Establish the conditions for architecture success through governance, decision rights, and principles. You learned how vision, business architecture, information systems direction, and technology direction work together to shape coherent target states. You learned how opportunities, solutions, migration planning, and implementation governance turn direction into executable roadmaps without micromanaging teams. Finally, you learned that architecture change management keeps the cycle alive and relevant as the enterprise evolves. Now that you can run the architecture development method cycle like an enterprise architect, you are ready to make architecture a repeatable decision making engine in your organization instead of a one time documentation effort. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with your architecture and delivery peers, and comment with the phase of the architecture development method cycle that you find hardest to apply in the real world and why.